Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for today's event, How to Boost Test Coverage with Automated Visual Testing. My name is Adi and I'm the event's moderator. Today's speaker is Joe Colantonio. Joe is a test architect for a Fortune 100 company, author of the UFT API Testing Manifesto, a frequent speaker at testing conferences, and the host of the popular podcast Test Talks, which you should definitely check out. Before we kick off, I just want to do a quick sound check. So if you could raise your hand, if you can hear me okay, just to make sure that the sound is working, you can raise your hand in the GoToWebinar control panel on your right. So with a show of hands, okay, so I see quite a few of hands raised. Great. So just a few more important things to keep in mind. Feel free to ask questions during the webinar. You can do that in the GoToWebinar control panel on your right. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the Q&A session at the end. Any unanswered questions will be answered via email, so worthwhile asking. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slide deck will be emailed to you tomorrow. For optimal viewing experience, I recommend you close off any unnecessary apps running in the background. And if you encounter any technical issues, please send me a private message in the chat box, also in the control panel on your right, and I will try to take care of it as soon as possible. So I think, Joe, I think you can kick off. The stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Adi. So today I'd like to go over how you can boost your test coverage using automated visual testing. So I'm going to go over why visual validation testing is becoming more and more important. And then I'm going to show a simple example of how you can easily add visual validation testing to a simple Selenium test. And then I want to finish by taking you through some slides that show you 5 to 6 unique ways that you can actually use visual validation testing to boost your test coverage. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Joe from joecolantonio.com, testtalks.com, and Automation Guild, a blog, podcast, and online conference dedicated to helping you perfect the craft of creating automation awesomeness. So I'm also an automation architect for a large Fortune 100 company, and I speak with a lot of folks. And one topic that always comes up over and over again is how to find visual bugs with automation. It seems to be a challenge with a lot of different people. So hopefully this will give you some insight into why visual validation is important, and also how you can start incorporating into your existing test frameworks to actually improve your testing efforts. So this was actually a pretty interesting slide I found while I was researching this topic. It's by Adobe, and they noticed that 39% of people will stop engaging with a website if the content layout is unattractive or the images won't load. So it may seem pretty trivial to you, but visual bugs like this will drive a user crazy. And it's even more important if you have a mobile user and someone's using a mobile app and there's a bug in it. If within 10 seconds they notice it's not working as they think, a lot of times with mobile apps, once they download it, they'll just delete it and never download it again. So it's really important that these visual aspects that the visual testing tools help you with really help you with customer satisfaction, making sure that everyone is being able to get the benefit out of your product. So another thing that always comes up on my podcast, I'm up to 130 interviews, and almost always when I'm speaking to a tester or a developer, we all come around the same theme over and over again, how more and more companies are moving towards Agile and DevOps practices, so like continuous integration, deployment, and more companies are trying to move faster and get their web apps and their applications into the hands of their customers as soon as possible. So this causes an issue because a lot of tests that require visual validation now are manual. And so if we want to go towards a more continuous integration, continuous deployment model, we really do need to automate. I really don't think you can succeed with modern software development practices nowadays without having automation in place. And I think visual validation is going to become more and more important to add that as part of your overall whole scenario or your whole goal or portfolio of test automation. So one of those challenges that you run into as we start trying to deploy quicker and faster is there's more and more configurations that we need to test against. Especially, once again, if you're developing mobile applications, there's all kinds of You need to be able to develop for a smartwatch, for an app, for a device, all kinds of different devices, all different OSs and configurations. So there's a lot of different things that you have to test for. And what really makes it even more difficult is if you have an existing test suite. A lot of times tests are impacted by browsers. Browsers are always updating themselves now. Like Chrome, what may have looked fine in Chrome 53, now for some reason doesn't look right in Chrome 54. Or you have different screen resolutions. People are browsing web applications with the various devices for mobile, tablets, desktops, and also a lot of responsive design. Your content needs to look good on all these different screen sizes and layouts. So it's really important that your application not only functions correctly, but it also looks correctly to users. And we'll go over an important why it's not even an aesthetic. It's also, it could actually hurt your business if you don't have visual validation tests in place. So to make matters worse, all these issues that we've talked to up to this point, a lot of those types of tests are difficult to automate using traditional methods, and they end up becoming manual tests. And we all know that too many manual UI tests are going to slow down your automation effort. I work for a fairly large company. We have around 1,500 tests. A lot of those tests, though, that could be automated were previously, before I learned about visual validation testing, were manual tests. And the reason why is they were checking things like layouts or doing things that even if you were to use a tool like Selenium or QTP, they weren't able to really test the UI aspect that we were trying to look for, that you need to do in order to have it be really reliable. These types of tools really weren't cutting it. Also, like I said before, if you have a lot of manual tests, this is even riskier if you're trying to deploy quicker and faster to your customers. Back in the day, if it was a web app, right, you had a bug or a visual bug, no problem. You just deployed the application to the web server, bam, and it was done. People that went to the website after that, no issues. They pick up the change automatically. But if you're developing for things like a mobile app, a lot of times that's going to be an issue because if there's a UI bug, they actually need to physically go and they need to update the devices. So anytime you put extra burden on the customer or your end user, those are issues you're going to run into. So you really want to try to avoid manual tests when you can. I'm not saying that all manual tests can be replaced, and I don't think all manual tests should be replaced. I'm a big believer in exploratory testing, but I think that a lot of tests that could be automated aren't automated because of the UI aspects are so hard to get right, and they don't really need necessarily an end user to look at it. There's also another issue I noticed as I was thinking about this. You'll see, stay with me, I'm building up to where this comes into play, but I was reading about a famous study where researchers were studying a form of invisibility known as inattentional blindness. It's a pretty famous study, and I'm pretty sure people that have seen this slide probably have seen this video before. But basically, inattentional blindness is basically an event when an individual fails to recognize an unexpected behavior that's in plain sight. So how many of us, I don't know, I'm smiling, have done this with manual testing? You have a procedure, manual test, step 1 through 10. You're performing 1 through 10 steps, and you're totally oblivious to anything outside those particular steps. That's where this really comes into play, inattentional blindness, and it's a real thing that causes issues. So in this example, researchers showed a video to the viewers and asked them to count the number of times the team in the white passed the ball, right? No problem. Count how many times the team in white passed the ball. But the problem was that most of the folks they interviewed after didn't even notice that a gorilla walked through the players. They didn't notice that there's a guy in a gorilla outfit that walked through, waved his arms, and walked off camera. And you wonder, how can they miss something like this? So I would definitely catch it, right? It's really a funny thing. I would say that you don't catch this. And a lot of times I hear some testers saying we should manually test everything because a manual tester would find this. And that may be true, but I would say that for some of these issues, UI issues, even if you had really thousands of manual testers, a lot of them would miss these issues because they're so focused on a set test. You may find it in exploratory testing, but even the types of visual tests I'm going to go over later on and show you, it would be very difficult for a manual tester to pick up. So that's why I'm really excited about visual validation testing, and I think it can actually help us overcome these types of issues like unintentional blindness that we may run into while we're doing our testing. So you may think, oh, that's a cute story, Joe. Who cares? How does this affect me? Well, it's kind of funny. I saw another study where they showed a CAT scan image to radiologists. And the reason why it's kind of funny is I happen to work at developing a software application for radiologists. So you can imagine this really caught my attention. And when they showed this slide to 24 radiologists, only 20 out of 24 radiologists, 20 out of 24 radiologists didn't notice the dancing gorilla in this image, which is probably kind of concerning, right? Because these are the people that are evaluating the slides, looking for any abnormalities that may be impacting your health. So these are real issues. Visual bugs, visual things like this are real issues. So notice, imagine if this was a real bug in your application where it was a visual bug that you didn't know, but it was impacting the way people were interacting with your application or making diagnosis of medical applications. So it really is important. And I notice I do this myself. Like I said, I've been doing automation for almost 16 years. Almost everyone I speak to on Test Talks has seen this. This is Dave Greenless. He was in episode 96 of Test Talks. And he's seen this what we went over, inattentional blindness. And the reason why is usually, like he said, testers really skip straight past quite obvious UI bugs because we're so focused on those steps in the test case, just completing those steps, that it's not because we're trying to be attentional, but it's not like we're trying to miss things. We really are doing our best effort, but because we're so focused, though, on those steps, we unintentionally miss UI bugs that really could cause critical issues within your application. So for all these reasons and a lot more, I think visual validation testing is important. So at this point, you might be asking, and I don't know how many people are familiar with visual validation testing, but you might be asking, what is visual validation testing? And I think a lot of people get this wrong. Visual validation testing really is a software quality assurance activity, and it's meant to verify that an application's UI appears correctly to users. But I think the problem is that most people confuse visual validation testing with traditional functional test tools like Selenium and QTP. And these tools are great, right? But the problem is Selenium and QTP were designed to help you test the functionality of your application. So think about that. They were designed to test the functionality of your application, not necessarily the UI, how the UI appears to a user. So Selenium QTP, they help you navigate through the UI and test the functionality of your application through the UI, like navigating to a website, clicking on a link, performing some sort of data entry into a field, and then moving on. But when we talk about visual validation testing, we really want to make sure the UI itself looks right to the user, and that each UI element looks right to the user, that the UI elements appear in the right shape, size, color, and location. And we also want to make sure that this doesn't hide or overlap any UI elements. So before I get to the slide, kind of funny, I just spoke to an engineer at Twitter yesterday for Test Talks on my upcoming episode, and he also worked at Huffington Post. And he actually told me about a UI bug where they had a bug where an element was in the wrong color. It was showing up as white on some of the pages, but they couldn't understand, before they figured this out, they couldn't understand why people's signups were dropping. They were looking at all their analytics, all their servers, all the log files, couldn't figure it out. It turned out there was a button, Sign Up Now button, that was white, and because it turned white, no one could click on it. No one knew it existed. So these really, if this was someone trying to purchase a product or try to contact you and they're not able to, it's going to cause a lot of frustration, and you don't want to cause frustration with the users. I've seen this myself. Here's an example of what I was talking about, the difference between a functional test and a visual test. So the top piece is the application, how it should appear. And the bottom is how the application should not appear. So the bottom is the older version, the top is the newer version. So what happened is a developer committed code to our application, right? Went through the continuous integration environment, and all our tests ran. We had 1,500 tests, all the unit tests passed, fantastic, right? But it turns out that people were complaining because the fields did not appear in the right place. And this is an application for radiologists, so this may not seem like a big issue, but if you're being audited by the FDA, medical devices, they really need to adhere to a certain standard. So what happened is they checked in older code, and the problem was all our Selenium tests passed. So we had this safety net, what we thought was a safety net of tests, thinking we were covered from a testing point of view, we could develop quickly, and it turned out we can't. And the reason why is, can you probably guess, is all these elements that we're interacting with are identified by IDs. So regardless of where they appear on the web page, because we're not using XPath or CSS, we're actually using IDs, we're able to interact with those IDs and carry on. So it wasn't able to pick up this visual bug. So think about all the other visual bugs that could occur in your application that isn't going to be picked up by your tests, because your tests were mostly designed for functional testing and navigation. And so this, like I said, is an actual UI bug that was not caught by a Selenium test suite. Another good point, and I think I have a slide in here that shows you, with a traditional functional testing tool, if you don't assert it, it doesn't get tested. So this drives me crazy. So I would have a manager look at our tests and say, well, you need to validate that the color's here, that the field's here, and we end up having a class that's like 500 lines of code, right? And all it's doing is assert that this is visible, assert that this is true, assert that this color exists, right? All these assertions just to try to test from a UI point of view. And a lot of times these assertions aren't even doing it from a UI point of view. It's just checking a DOM and making sure that it gets back the right HTML, but it's not really checking to say, does this look correctly, right? So we have these blocks of code that are dedicated to assertions that aren't even giving us the bang for our buck that we think they are. They're not giving us the coverage that we think we're getting, and it takes a lot of time to maintain them and keep them up to date. So it's a big pain. So a lot of times with tests, a manager will say, well, how come this test passed? Well, this test wasn't testing that functionality. It only tests what you tell it to test. It's really a dumb script. It only does what you tell it to do. But as you'll see later, once we add visual validation testing to it, with a simple checkpoint, we'll be able to catch things without actually literally asserting, check this, this, and this. And it's going to save you a lot of time. We'll see that shortly. All right, so some folks here probably run into this problem and said, oh, no problem. I'll use a tool like Sakuli or UFT Insight. UFT Insight is a plugin to UFT that allows you to compare images. So all these tools are image-based test tools. And these tools are great. I love these tools. I've used every one of them, not knocking these tools. But these tools, once again, really are more for functional testing. And what they're mostly used for is for testing like thick client applications maybe that have custom objects in that you're not able to spy on. So you can use these tools to interact with them, and the way they get around it is by using images. But once again, it's still functional testing. All you're doing, though, is using images to identify elements that you want to interact with and using those images to help you create a functional test. Once again, it's still not a UI test. And if you do use some of these tools, a lot of times a script might only work on a particular computer, right? And the reason why is a lot of issues, it'll drive you nuts. So you may end up running a test just on a certain computer because that's where it was designed against. But the issue is a lot of these tools, because they're image-based, they run into issues with called pixelation, anti-aliasing. So I have a few slides here, and I'm going to toggle between these two slides. So here's a slide of an image of something called a playlist, right? It's this menu. And if I toggle between these, you'll notice these little deviations. You'll notice shading changing. You notice slate shifting. It looks slightly different. And the problem with this is these are issues that if you use a tool like UFT, the image comparison, or Sakuli, a lot of times they'll fail because they'll notice these differences, these minute differences, and say it's a difference, so they'll fail you. They won't be able to interact with it. When in fact, because it doesn't really impact your user's experience, your users don't care that these pixels are slightly shifted. They can't even see it, right? But your tests are failing. You're getting false positives. And when you get false positives for these things, once you get false positives, it's really a quick way that kills your test automation. So that's one reason why these other tools really weren't made for UI testing per se. They were mostly used for functional testing. So wouldn't it be great if there was a way to easily catch bugs from a user's perspective? So what we're looking at here is on the left is a baseline image of what the CAT scan looked like before. And on the right is what the CAT scan looked like after. So I've gone ahead and I've doctored these slides just to show you. And I sucked this image into Applitools, and I had Applitools tell me what were the differences between these images. And it was able to identify the dancing gorilla that most radiologists weren't able to identify that we went over earlier. So I think that's really, really powerful.
um, because when you use a visual validation tool like Applitools, it's different from other image-based technology because it really was designed from the ground up to handle visual validation. It was developed for visual validation testing. It wasn't designed as a functional test tool that, hey, maybe we can, work around it and hack it to work for UI testing. It really was created from the ground up for UI visual validation testing. And it really has a really cool, super sophisticated algorithm that I've seen be pretty reliable. It's actually a tool I use, so it handles it really well. I don't get a lot of those false positives like I was getting when I was using the other approaches like Sakuli for this type of testing. So this subject, the reason why I got into visual validation is this actually comes up a lot on my podcast. This is Mike Lyle's episode 88, and he talked about how a lot of times a visual validation tool will catch what people's eyes don't see, what the naked eye really can't even catch sometimes, because there's so many things on the page that you need to look at. And we'll see in an example what I'm talking about, but it really can help you get some coverage out of the box with some simple checks that can catch things that you couldn't catch or be very difficult to catch if you had to manually assert every single thing. So I want to get started with the demo. Unfortunately, of course, Murphy's Law, my demo laptop crashed. So I was going to do a hands-on demo, but luckily I have screenshots from this in case this ever occurred. So I have an older slide deck of the demo, but it's the same exact thing you would see on my desktop. It actually would probably be better because I could kind of slow down and you could see things without me messing anything up during a live type event. So I just want to show you how you can actually, what's great about Applitools or visual validation testing is you don't have to start from scratch. What you can do is you can take your existing test suite and you can modify it to include UI visual validation testing. And there's a lot of other tools for visual testing. For this example, I'll be using Applitools. And Applitools really supports, my experience, everything. I work for a large company, and that's one of the reasons why we went with it. You may have people developing in Python, C#, Java, JavaScript, anything, right? It pretty much supports anything. It's just an API, an SDK that you pull into this existing test suite, and you can use it. And it's not just for Selenium, but this example happens to be for Selenium. So like I said, this is an older slide deck, this portion of it. This is when I give a presentation at Star East. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to navigate to the Star East website, to my topic, and then I wanted to click on my name and go to my the next screen, which would tell more people about my name. So that's the flow of this test, very simple. So here's the test without any visual validation in it. So if you take a look at it, it should seem pretty simple. Like I said, it's just a standard Selenium script. All we're doing is importing the Chrome driver, using the Chrome driver. Once we have a Chrome driver instance, I'm just using the get to navigate to the website. Once I get to the website, I'm just looking for an element that has my name, which is Joe Colantonio. I click on it, and then I close the driver. That's the whole script. So I just want to show you now how you can easily modify the script to add visual validation. And like I said, if you have a lot of tests already, you don't have to start from scratch. You can easily enhance your test already with something like Applitools. So we're going to take a look at how we can do that. Okay, remember I said Applitools pretty much supports everything I've noticed. So this, I'm using Java, I'm using Maven. So this is how I'm able to incorporate it within our framework. I just added it to my POM file. So all I had to do was add it to the POM file. If you're not using Maven or a POM file, you can just import the classes, the Java files into your class path. But this way, because I'm using Maven, I was just able to easily add it to my Maven file. So once you add it to your Maven file, Maven will look for it and it'll pull down all the dependencies needed for Applitools. All right, so what I had to do in my existing script is I just need to import 3 libraries, and we'll go over what each one of these mean later. But 3 main libraries are the eyes, the match level, and the rectangle size. So just 3 import statements. Nothing new here. It's just importing the eyes library with some of the different SDKs. So
very first line of code that I would enter is I've already instantiated my Chrome driver, and so the next step is I need to instantiate the eyes object. And basically the eyes is the main object in the Applitools SDK. So this is what gives you everything, all the methods. So once you have a reference to eyes, you can access pretty much all the methods available to you for Applitools. So here are the main ones that I always set. So after I create a eyes instance, as we saw earlier, next all I need to do is I need to set my API key. So when you use Applitools, you get a customer-specific API key. You just need to plug that in, and it helps you identify your tests when they run within the Applitools application. So set the API key. The next, I do this all the time, this next parameter is set force full page screenshot. And why this is really cool, you can set it to true or false. I set it to true. It's if you go to a web page that expands the browser port that you see on your web page, on your desktop, it will stitch together the full web page. So it'll take a full screenshot of the whole page. So if you were to go to my conference page, say if you go to automationguild.com, Adi, just so you know, if you could add that link to the chat, it may be helpful for folks to check out. But it's a very large page, so you have to scroll through it. What it does when you run this against that web page, it'll scroll through the whole web page, and in the end, it'll create one image for you.
Joe,
the next one is just
just a second.
Yes.
Which link did you want me to add to the chat box?
Automationguild.com.
Oh, okay, no problem. I'll add it now. Thanks.
All right. So once you have the screenshot set to true, then I'm just setting a baseline name. So I'm just calling it. This was the name of the test. And then I'm just setting a match level. So what's cool about Applitools is they give you 4 or 5 different levels. One is very strict, so it will change. It will notice all differences. Other ones are layout based. So layout is what I'm using. Layout's cool because if you had a really app that is updated all the time, like Yahoo or a portal like that, you can check to make sure that the layout is correct, and it will ignore all the text. So it's a big time saver. For this example, I just wanted to do a basic layout. And so once I have that match level set, the next one is just using the eyes.open. And this just has this method just has four parameters. The driver, which we already used within Selenium, so I'm just passing it the Selenium driver. I'm giving it the app name. I just happen to call it Star East. The next parameter is a test name. So this represents the name of the test. And it's actually the name of the test that will show up in your report and the results. And then the viewport size. So the viewport size is, say you had a actual requirement that said your application needs to render at 1000 by 800 and needs to look correctly. You can actually tell it, this is the port size I want to use for the test. So I just happen to set it to 1000 by 800. So once you have that set, once again, I'm just navigating to the website. So if you remember, I'm just navigating to the TechWell website. And on that first page, I want to verify everything on that page. Right? Normally, if I was using any other tool, I'd have to assert this color, assert this space. It would be thousands of assertions if I really wanted to assert everything on that page. Here's where all the magic happens within Applitools. This is the Applitools visual validation checkpoint. And the checkpoint window will take a snapshot of the current window, and it's going to perform a smart visual comparison of that window with the baseline. So the first time you run it, it's not going to have a baseline. So it'll create a baseline. It'll tell you, hey, you have a new baseline. I've never seen this before. Please approve it. You click on it, you approve it. When you rerun it, it then compares itself to that baseline going forward. So if there's any differences between the baseline and what happens after that point, it will be flagged as a visual validation bug, as a visual concern. And what's good is you can have someone manually go in and look at it and say, is this really an issue or not? And we'll see that. But it saves you a lot of time because, like I said, rather than having thousands of assertions, you just have one assertion that does it for you. And when it does fail, it is usually because it was designed for visual validation. Any small changes to pixels that we saw before that usually cause scripts to fail doesn't affect it. So it really focuses only on the changes that a human can see, which is going to reduce your false failures or your false positives, because false positives will drive you nuts. All right, so once I have that in place, I have my checkpoint. I navigate I click on the Joe Colantonio link, brings me to the next page, and I just want to validate that whole page. So I just added another check window called About Joe Colantonio. Once again, this is an Applitools method that's going to check the whole window for me. And I'm just going to close the eyes and close my browser. So this is what the full script looks like. It's what, 5 or 6, 7, maybe 8 lines to actually add visual validation to it. This is not an optimal way to do it. I've abstracted it to the level now where we have a method where I just do applitools.start and applitools.end in my framework. So I don't even have to do this boilerplate code. So this is just to show you how you can do it. But this is just really, this is not optimal. This is just to show how you can add to an existing script, but you can refactor this to make it even more easier so you can get reuse out of it and not have to do this for all your tests. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what visual validation testing is, how you can incorporate it into a test to give you a flavor for how it works. So as I said, the first time you run the test, if it's new, if it's never seen that screen before, it's going to give you in your IDE, it'll have a link and say, there's a new baseline, can you please approve it? And I'll have a link to it. And when you click on that link, it'll actually bring you right into the Applitools application, which is based in the cloud, or we have an on-site implementation. But either way, it'll bring you right into the Applitools application. This is actually the newer UI. It's pretty cool. What it will do is we'll show you the image that it captured. And what you could do is you could do things like you can tell it to ignore certain aspects of it. So it has a tool where you can ignore areas. You could tell it it's okay to move within a certain boundary. So for example, say my boost test coverage moved a few pixels to the left and right that were noticeable to the end user, but to me I didn't care about. You can tell it it's okay as long as it falls within this level. Don't flag it as an issue. So the first time it goes in, first time you run your test, it captures a baseline, and then we'll use that baseline going forward. So in my live demo, I actually inserted an error. So for this web page, what I did is I went in, and to trigger a UI difference, I found the paragraph for my name, my Joe Colantonio, the paragraph under that, and I shifted it right 120 pixels. So the first time it ran, it had it correctly. And the second time I ran it, forced it to move all that text 120 pixels to the right. Okay, so when I ran it, it goes, oh, wait a minute, this does not look like the baseline. So when I run this JavaScript here is going to force that text to move to the right 120 pixels, and that's just so I can force an error. So once I did that, your test will fail, and it also gives you a link saying, hey, there's some issues here, here are the details, you can go in and look at the details. And when I say this is the best of both worlds, a lot of people get kind of freaked out if you say your whole process is automated and you don't need anyone to look at it, right? Probably not a good idea. I don't care how sophisticated things are. You probably want a real user to look at something, especially if it's really critical. So you get the best of both worlds. It's automated, it will flag it, but a real user can go in then and look at this in the application and see, okay, what was that visual difference? So what we see here is the image of the second run. So it's saying that compared to the baseline, the things in this purple color are different. So if anything here was different, say any other elements were different, all those also would be highlighted in this purple color. And if you were to bring up the application, it will show, you can show the baseline with the new image side by side, and we'll show you all the differences. And it can, it has a thing called sonar where it can pinpoint exactly where all the differences are. There's a lot of things you could do in the UI. But this really tells you the differences, and it's really cool. And if it's a real bug, you can flag it as a bug, or say it's a design difference. So rather than have to change anything, you could just say, except going forward, this is the way the application is going to look. I want this to be the new baseline. So that's how it works. It captures a baseline image, and it compares itself against that image. Like I said, Applitools is not the only visual validation tool out there. There's a lot of other tools out there, and a lot of these are open source. But I think Applitools, maybe the Facebook one, are the only ones I know to work on both web and app. And like I said, I work with a large company, so we have all kinds of technologies, and Applitools works with pretty much all of them, where these are really application specific. So if you have large teams, you have to have a different solution for all the different technologies. So you have code-based and configuration-based. Like I said, it's not as straightforward as what I found Applitools to be. But if for some reason you want to check it out, here's some other tools to take a look at to get started with visual validation if you don't have Applitools or you're thinking about purchasing Applitools. So just a recap of what we went over, how it works. You create a test, a UI, you create a typical functional test. You then add Applitools to do the UI piece. It takes screenshots. When you rerun it, it compares the screenshots with those baseline images. It then reports any differences it might find between the baseline and the image. And then you can either update the baseline or you can flag it as a real bug. All right, so here are some cool ways you can use visual tests to boost your test coverage. So these are things that I found working for a large company, ways we could do other things with visual testing other than just vanilla things. I think these are kind of cool. So the first one is we have UX requirements. So we have a folder of our application, and we have 20 or 30 documents of UX type-based testing where it actually calls out this needs to be this color, this font needs to be this font, this setting needs to look like a certain setting, all these different requirements. So someone was manually going in, looking at this requirement and comparing it against the actual image. With visual validation testing, like I said, because it's just one check window, one checkpoint, I could check all these images, all these changes, and when I rerun it, it gets it automatically without me having to actually call out all these individually. So it's a big time saver. So that's one way we've used it is for our UX testing. We're able to take a bulk of manual tests that are really time consuming and automate it using visual validation and using a check window. So this one might be a little hard to see, and this was something before we had Applitools was flagged as a manual test. So someone gave me an email and said, the scenario involves verifying that if a title is too long, that the UI will truncate and the title will display as ellipses, right? So it's really hard to see, really hard to if you were to do this functionally, it would be really hard to do. Even if you had manual testers looking at it, it'd be really time consuming. So they were able to work around it by using the Selenium to check for the CSS value to see the text overflow. But the problem is the title being displayed didn't show them anything. It really didn't test the UI aspect of it. So what we did is we just created a UI check called check ellipse, and we were able to automate it. So we were able to convert a manual test to an automated test. And as I said, it was a test that really didn't require a manual test. It just was manual because there was no way to really automate it in a way that made it reliable and easy to use. So here's an example of how Applitools picked up the issue. On the left is the baseline with the ellipses, and then when we reran it, it'll pick up the defect, it'll highlight the differences, and we'll flag it. And I think this would be very difficult to do manually. It was very difficult to do manually. A lot of people would forget it. What's great, like again, it's an automated test. Every time they check in now, we can run this test, and we don't have to do the manual piece of this. So this goes with that other slide I talked about earlier. If you don't assert it, it doesn't get checked. Here's an example of an assertion. This is an actual code from our framework, right? It's check in patient name, product date, modality, descriptions, all this information. We had to create methods for all these to check it. And so it would check, does this equal, does this equal? So here's the class before Applitools, right? Verify exams. Here's it before. There's it after. Bam. Let's look at it again. Before. After. One line. Eyes check window exams. That's crazy. So if you have to maintain a framework, if you're in charge of the framework, this will save you some time. Also, we'll make sure that things are getting checked. Even, see, this is like 5 assertions. Say they were like, oh, we forgot the 7th assertion. This would miss that, but this check would catch it because it catches everything on that window. Also, another great user case is cross-browser. So here's an actual example.
We work with hospitals, and for some reason hospitals are still in love with IE9. So you actually have to test against IE9. So it's very difficult to test against IE9, IE11. When you run Applitools, you can run it against any browser, any version, and it will compare it against the baseline and highlight any differences. So here's a visual bug that was caught between IE11 and IE9. I don't know if you can notice, but the imaging history is cut off in IE9. This will drive our product owners crazy, especially if it gets delivered to the user. They're like, how come you didn't catch this? Well, you know, sometimes it's hard to catch these things. But this is one reason, especially if a lot of your developers and everyone are testing with the latest version of the browser and not necessarily thinking about the older version. But Applitools allows you to catch them. Here's another user case I found out from Percy Abba, episode 92 of Test Talks. This is something he does, and after I talked to him, I'm like, I'm going to try that. And so what he did for all their upgrades, what they do is they push all the data into their environment that contains new code, and then they take a screenshot, and then they compare it to all the Applitools baselines. So they can actually see if anything goes wrong with that deploy. So it's just kind of like a smoke test, right? Where they sent the new stuff out, and they just run these images and compare it against the baselines. They're able to quickly find out whether or not that deploy worked or not. So once I heard this idea, I said, oh, this is a great idea. I need to try it myself. So what I did is I added it to my test suite. And here's an example of a deploy validation where every night we have our application. We have a job in electric commander. It's like Jenkins. It goes, deploys the application to the servers, does database things, turns services on and off, and then the Selenium test kickoff. And a lot of times the Selenium test will fail because the deploy was wrong and take some time to figure out why that happened. But now with visual validation testing, I know that these values should be populated. Visual validation testing, it catches and notices that the values weren't populated. Once again, it's probably hard to see in this screenshot, but on the left, there's actual numbers of exams that I expect to have, data that should be there. And on the right, it's all zeros. And I just know because it's all zeros, I happen to know that something happened to the database. So even just going in the morning and looking at the Applitools dashboard to look at these images helps you troubleshoot really quickly. So that's another thing with maintenance of test. If it takes you 10 minutes to debug a script, if you have to step through a script, you're gonna fail with automation because you need to deploy quickly and fast. You need to find these issues quickly. So this is one way I can find issues fairly quickly by going to a dashboard and just look at images and see things at a high level. Another question I get asked all the time is PDF testing. So here's an actual request from an email I got from someone saying they had a bunch of HTML style sheets that they were formatting to HTML and PDF documentation. They wanted to compare the PDFs after the transformation. And they wanted to know if it was possible to automate. They had someone manually doing this. And I'm like, ugh. I couldn't think of one at that point, but Applitools to the rescue. Applitools can be used for PDF testing. So here's an example of, on the left is the baseline PDF, and on the right is the newer PDF after the transformation. I don't know if you could tell, once again, by the screenshot, but the text is larger on the right, and on the left, it's actually missing a character on the right. So it was able to pick up differences within PDFs. So if you're doing automation, a lot of times automation isn't just a web browser, right? It's a lot of other things. Applitools can be used for both web browsers, apps, and PDF testing, which is kind of cool. Here's a big user case, especially for us, localization testing. So we actually had a team that had a framework. In their framework, they had Excel spreadsheets. And those Excel spreadsheets had the original language and what the new language should be, what it should be, what the translation should be. And then we had to ship out these Excel sheets to an expert that says, okay, yes, this is the correct translation. And so the script would run. They'd run the browser in a localization mode, and then they would run the test. That's fine. It's very hard and clunky though, and a lot of times it's hard to catch issues, especially with Asian-based languages. So here's an example of using Applitools for localization. Once again, what's cool is you can use a baseline image. Here's how, so you don't even have to know what the language is. You just do a baseline of what it looks like, get that baseline approved. Like I said, because it's a web app, someone that knows what that language should be can go in and say, yes, this is the right translation, and no, it's wrong. So it gives you multiple uses almost. So localization
You can take the baseline. Someone could then go into the application and say, is this the right translation? They can say, yes, I approve this baseline. And then going forward, every time you run that test, if it sees any differences between the two, it will flag it. So localization testing, this is a big, big deal. I read a study somewhere, I forget where it said, but most of the growth in apps have been outside of the U.S., outside of English-speaking countries. So I think more and more companies are going to be moving towards this. So localization testing, I think, is going to be a hot topic in the future. So Applitools can handle it. This is Peter Kim. He does a lot of visual validation testing with localization. He's actually going to be at the Automation Guild with a hands-on session with visual validation, which will be a hands-on. He'll show you with the screen live. Well, it's a live recording, how he codes it and what it looks like. So it's really cool. And localization testing is extremely difficult to automate, and using a tool like visual validation with Applitools or something else really helps because he can't think of any other strategy of doing it without visual validation testing. And I think this is a growing area. Another area which is really big is performance testing. So I'm an old school performance tester. And so what I mean by that is, and when I started, I'd send a response to a server, I get a response back, bam, my performance test is done, right? I was just checking the request and response. Now though, because of a lot of applications really are front-end heavy with JavaScript, a lot of times you'll get a request back and think that that it's been fulfilled, but the screen itself is still thinking, right? You get these loading issues. And these are really hard to get a realistic performance number from. But with Applitools, you can actually catch this to say, wait for this to go away, which is really neat. Or you could say, make sure within a certain amount of time, the full image that I expect appears. So here's an example of performance testing, and in the script itself, all you need to do is add these eyes.test response time, and then within there you can just tell it to wait a measured amount of time for something to occur. So this is how you can use it for performance testing. All right, so here's a bonus usage. I don't read People magazine, okay, but my wife happens to have them hanging around, and they have this thing in it, I forget what it's called, it's like similar or some, it's this thing where they take an image of a famous person, and then they take another image and they make it different, slightly different, and see if you can tell the difference between the two. And I never get them right, never, right? So I said, I wonder if I can use Applitools for this. So what I did is I took an image of the before and the after, I did the comparison, and Applitools actually noticed the difference. The nose is bigger in one of them, the button in the middle is bigger than the other. It even picked up on the skirt of the little girl, there's a line, the line's longer in the other one. So it really picks up all these things. It notices the hair was longer on the one on the left than it is on the right. This would have driven me crazy for days, and my wife would throw out all the People magazine. So she doesn't have to do it anymore. If I have any issues, I just throw it into Applitools. So that's a bonus usage. So hopefully you found out why visual validation is important, how you can incorporate it in your existing test suite, and all these cool, unique ways you can use it to help you with other issues that you may be struggling with that you may not have thought of. And here's the last quote from Dave Hefner, Test Talks 88. He thinks this is the future. I agree with him. He's spent a whole year researching new technologies, really getting into automated visual testing, and he really thinks that, I agree with Dave, that with just a few lines of code, the future could be yours now using visual testing. Of course, like any automation, it's not perfect, but it brings you closer to what you're trying to achieve. And so if you want more automation awesomeness, I just want to announce that I'm starting an online conference. It's the first ever conference of its kind, online, dedicated 100% to automation, and it's going to have some of the biggest speakers in test automation, biggest engineers, Dave Hefner, Alan Richardson, Pekka Clark, who created the robot framework, Matt Wine, who is the Cucumber main contributor, a bunch of speakers where they're actually going to give hands-on presentations that have pre-recorded videos of them showing you exactly how to do a certain tool or technique, and then during the conference they'll be live for Q&A based on about their session. So you get the best of both worlds. So it's not like a webinar. You have really good quality audio and video with hands-on, someone showing you the code, not like I did, but actually showing the screens. And then you get to ask them questions during the conference itself. So to learn more about that, you can head on over to automationguild.com. And with that, that's all I have, Adi. Any questions?
Yeah, sorry. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Perfect. Yeah, we have a lot of questions and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And Joe, you are keeping that slide up there so people can copy the information and the link, right?
Absolutely.
Very great. Perfect. So first question, what kind of limit should you put on what you visually test? For example, if I have to test on all browsers and multiple operating systems, that brings a lot of hardware overhead to support that. If we had unlimited resources, that would not be an issue, but we don't. So what do you recommend?
So it really is a discussion between your team on what's important, what's the meaning of your test. So if you're doing a test to verify that you're able to rate an insurance policy, you probably just want to make sure that the rate button's available and someone can rate it. So you just need to, like I said, with Applitools, what's great about it is you can ignore certain elements. So if you just want to focus on one aspect, you can. So you don't have to check the whole page if you don't want to. You can just check out certain areas you think are really important. I think Dave Hefner in his book has some good things like the money path, the mission critical path. And what's great about Applitools, because it's a web application, your product owner can go in and say, okay, I notice you're checking this and this. This is what our users really care about. Or they may say, you know what, they really don't care about that. We can ignore that. So it really is a discussion really with your team. And I think that's the way I would approach it.
Great. So we got a few questions about Applitools and other UI testing tools, and basically I think the ones that most repeated themselves are, what is the difference between Ranorex and Eyes, and what is the difference between Eyes and bitmap comparison? So I wondered if you could address those issues.
So in my experience, the difference is Applitools was designed for visual validation testing, and it could work with multiple technologies. So I'm not familiar with those other two. I haven't used them specifically. I just know in my experience with some of the other ones, with the Applitools, it seems to be more reliable because it doesn't pick up these little pixel differences that the user doesn't care about, where the other ones usually are tied to a specific piece of technology. So I haven't use both those tools. I'd have to look at them, but in my experience, I've had a good experience with Applitools, so that's what I end up using. And also because I work for a large company, we have so many teams that it's just easier just to use a tool that everyone can use and not have to worry about which one they're going to use.
Okay, next question. In your first Applitools examples with the radiology shots, are those the same images with the gorilla just added in there, or were they two different slides? Wait, the question popped up. Two different slides in the same radiology scan.
So all I did was, that was just for kind of fun. I took the radiology scan in one shot. I ran the test, got the baseline. I got that same shot, and I added the gorilla in. I reran the test, and it compared itself against it. So I just wanted to see if it was able to pick up the gorilla, and it did. So that was the whole point of that slide.
Okay, will screen size affect the visual testing even if you use full page screenshots?
It shouldn't affect it. It's able to adjust it, and if it does, you can adjust it within the Applitools application to handle that.
Okay, great. How do you check pages that have items that change every run? For example, purchase reference numbers that are generated by a third party and are displayed on the screen, or date and time that is also displayed on the screen.
Yeah, so what's awesome about Applitools is once you get your baseline, when you bring it into Applitools, it has other tools you can use to modify that baseline. So you can actually have regions that you can ignore. So if you have a price that's changing, or say you're, I don't know why I keep going back to insurance, but if you're rating a policy, you can get rid of the actual policy number that's generated, or the total, or whatever. You can just highlight those little areas and say, ignore this. I don't care about this, and it will ignore it. So anything that's generated uniquely that always changes, all you need to do is just go to that baseline and say, ignore this area. So when it reruns, it will just ignore it completely.
Okay, we got a few questions about baselines, and I think this is one of the ones that was repeated the most. How easy it is to change your baseline once you've set it?
So before, it was kind of it was a little difficult. Now, with the Applitools, I wish I could show it on my screen, but you should check it out. They have a new UI, and the new UI allows you to do mass baseline acceptance. So when you go in now, it has, like, say you have 30, 40, 50 images. You don't have to approve every single one of those baselines. If you know there's a change, say your application was updated, and you know that they changed, it's a known change, you could just click on accept all these 50, and you can accept all the baselines. So there's different ways to do it, but you can do bulk acceptance, so it's not that big of a deal now.
Okay. So next question. I liked your IE9 versus IE11 comparison, and notice it contained patient data above. Obviously, the above area will change depending on the patient. Do you ignore the region above containing patient data, or do you always test with the same user and avoid randomization?
So it's a good point. But this particular test, we use the same data. So I set up the data, I know what user I'm supposed to get, and then I clean it up when the test ends. So in that particular case, I care about the user, so that's why that data was in there. But if for some reason it was unique, say it is a specific test, for some reason it just generates something random, you can ignore those regions like we said with the tool within Applitools.
So yeah, we're getting a lot of baseline questions here. Where do you store the baseline images?
So the baseline images, Applitools is a cloud-based product. So when you run the test, it will take an image and will place it in the cloud for you. Or they have on-site premise. To work for a company like I do, a big company, that they're paranoid of everything. You could have an in-house one, but you'll have a server set up, and that server is where the images would be stored. And what's great about that is it's not stored on one person's place, so anyone can log in and look at it. I've seen people use this, like product owners use it, just to see how things are going within the application, make sure things are progressing as they expect. So because it's just a web interface, they can go in and view these images, but those images are stored within the Applitools server.
Great. Do you isolate your visual testing from your UI functional tests, or do you add them to the same spec files?
So once again, it depends on what the test is doing. So I add them to both, but at a high level, I'll add them to a few of the functional ones. But I do have a few, like the UX ones, that are specific just to, I have a UX folder, a UX package, and I just have tests just for UX based. Well, I'll just do that for UX. So it depends, once again, what you're trying to achieve, but you can do it either way.
Okay, so I think that we are out of time, so we'll take just one last question before we close off. So we have a question about how does Applitools verify moving images, object, change in color, and can it verify the correct font or changes in font and typeface?
Yes. So that's what the UX test that I showed earlier on that slide. Our application needs to have a certain font. So it doesn't necessarily know what the font name is, but it will tell you what the differences are if the font has changed. So it is able to pick up those differences. And like I said, you can make it as strict as you want. So you can have it run in strict mode, and it will pick up all the differences. There's different settings you can use, but yeah, it'll definitely pick up different fonts. In one of my slides, I think the font actually became larger, and it picked it up. So it is able to pick up those differences. I give that example of that engineer at Twitter. The font, the color of the button was white, so no one could see it. So it was able to pick that up, that, hey, this isn't supposed to be white. So it is able to pick up colors, images, locations, shapes, sizes. So yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention we have a lot of questions waiting to be answered, but we are out of time, and I promised everyone will get a personal answer via email in the next couple of days. That's a promise. And Joe, I want to thank you for this very informative presentation, and I want to thank everyone that joined us today, and I hope to see you at our next event, and definitely check out Automation Guild Conference coming up in January.
Awesome. Thank you.